And yay. Oh man, isn't that just the sweetest sound, Zoom lady? It's like this meeting is being recorded. Of course it is. Everything is. So the other thing, I don't know if Zoom is real or not because it kind of lets people in the door slowly. And I would think that technology would just be like there would be no gateway like this while you watch the stock ticker, you know, just kind of queue up. So it gives it this weird feeling of filing in when it could be completely artificial. It could be like the Uber cars where they're just zooming around really close to you, but they don't actually exist, you know? So just give that a second before we get started. And I can do my like really gentle NPR voice where everybody is welcome and nothing hurts. So that's the one thing that I like AM talk radio for. It's like everybody's just yelling all the time. All right, so I think we're close to the amount of people that were registered, and of course, there's going to be a recording of this. But I wanted to say welcome everyone to another installment seminar series with Big If True. Joan Donovan, I'm the research director over at the Harvard Kennedy School's Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy. And I'm the director of the Technology and Social Change Research Project, where we look at all things media manipulation and disinformation. If you're interested in our research, you can find it at mediamanipulation.org, where we have a whole bunch of case studies where we look very in-depthly at media manipulation campaigns, tactics. We have some methods documents where you can read about how to do this work. And it ties in actually really nicely to the theme of today that we're going to be looking at, where we're going to be looking at amplified hate and its effects. And we have an incredible set of panelists where we want to welcome back, of course, Brandi Collins-Dexter, who has been working with our team as a fellow. And she's been writing a book about disinformation, Black political agendas, coordinated attacks on Black technoculture, as well as she was the former campaign director, a senior campaign director at Color of Change, where she looked at the role media plays in technology and information integrity. And Brandi is going to allow me to announce the name of her book on this program. It's Brandi's new book that will be out in sometime 2022 is Black Skinhead, which is a continuation of the conversation that we had started having when she arrived at Shorenstein, and is just, it's just going in some really wild directions. I love getting updates on it. We also have a couple of amazing folks here that are I got to know them during the sort of aftermaths of the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, and the kind of activism and community journalism that they've been able to do since then has been both inspiring, but also you get the goods. I mean, you really are able to get the knowledge that a lot of people aren't willing to sit down and collate into the hands of other key stakeholders, but especially into the hands of people in the community that need to know who are a danger. So Molly Conger is an independent journalist covering municipal government in Charlottesville, and if you follow her on Twitter, it's at Socialist Dog, and you get both very, very detailed tweets about community meetings and beautiful dogs. And they're also a far-right researcher. And when she's not sitting through these city board meetings or sifting through neo-Nazi forums, she enjoys spending time with the two dash hounds, Otto and Buck. And I love these dogs. I kind of secretly hope one will make an appearance during today's talk. As well, Emily Gorcenski is a data scientist, an engineer, and activist, a 10-year resident of Charlottesville, and she's a survivor of the neo-Nazi violence from the Unite the Right rally in 2017, Combining these experiences with her technical background, she created First Vigil, which I hope people will go visit, which is a multimedia data project designed to combat the rise of fascism with information. And it's good information. It's lots and lots of documents that would be scattered to the winds if someone didn't put in the time to collate and curate them. For her efforts, she was named one of Bitches Magazine's most influential feminists of 2018, and I'll say probably of 2020 and 2021 to come, and continues to engage in data journalism against the far right from her new home in Berlin. So thank you for being here at this time as well. I appreciate that. And then on the nerd side of the house, which is usually where I tend to hang out, been able to recruit from their very busy schedules, Kathleen Belew, who's a historian, author, and teacher, specializes in the history of the present. She spent 10 years researching and writing her first book, Bring the War Home, The White Power Movement and Paramilitary America. And I've been very thankful for the work that Kathleen has done to bring the notion or the idea of a white power movement into public talking points. It was instrumental in getting rid of this title of the alt-right, which was a very soft cover for a white power movement. In it, she uses previously classified FBI documents, vivid testimonials, and to explore how white power activists created a social movement through a common story about betrayal by the government, war, and its weapons and uniforms and technologies. And it's very prescient to have you here because I think what you know from the past can help us interpret the future. And then, of course, one of my favorite people to roll around the Zoom in with, Whitney Phillips. We could probably end up being here all day. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Communication and Rhetorical Studies at Syracuse University. And Whitney researches and teaches classes on media literacy, mis and disinformation, political communication, digital ethics, journalist ethics, and the ethics of social media use. You would think that we wouldn't need so many ethics, but unfortunately, we live in a society where lots of things seem to be going wrong. So I wanted to thank you all for coming and being part of this chat. I really just, when things like the Capitol siege happened, we can even talk a little bit about why I probably shouldn't call it the Capitol siege. When that happened, I got in the DMs. I started flying around some ideas, and I was just very thankful that in my messages and invitations to you all that you were willing to come and talk about how we got here and where we might be going. But by first round, I would love to have everybody just kind of check in for maybe about 2 minutes to talk about, not necessarily what happened on the 6th, but what were some of the things that you were seeing that made you think, oh, this is about to kick off? And for me, it really was watching live streams of white supremacists where they had started to travel. They started to show up at different state capitals. They were in Georgia, they were in Michigan, they were in Pennsylvania. And I'm talking about social media influencers that would love for me to say their name. A few of them that now banished, of course, to even more D-list streaming sites than they had been in the past. But this particular configuration of folks that were united under the banner of Stop the Steal were spending an inordinate amount of time and obviously resources trying to build momentum. And when we look at movements and the way that movements build momentum, one of the ways they do that is they'll have a series of events in a short amount of time that tries to build power and build excitement. And then, of course, when the events of December 12th happened, where the Proud Boys had burned those stolen Black Lives Matter banners, to, a very small crowd in DC, but to tens of thousands of people online, with all of the implied optics of the KKK and the use of fire itself. And then there were no arrests. There was no justice. I thought to myself, uh-oh, like this is going to come back even worse and bigger, because when you have no accountability in moments like that, when white nationalists, white supremacists are expressing their intents in such violent ways, that the next event usually is bigger and worse. I will go to Molly first. Hey, Molly.
No.
Oh no. Yeah, come on. You know.
Oh goodness. I mean, the lead up to the event, I've said this before, people, so it was in DC on the 6th. And as it was happening, I'm seeing people online talking about like, how could this have happened? No one could have seen this coming. I said, what are you talking about? I followed a map I found online. Like, this event was planned and organized online in public places. I do some infiltration work. Like I joined the Oath Keepers, I joined some of these smaller militias, and I was in some private organizing spaces. But a lot of the information I had was public. It was from somebody registered a domain to put up these full color PDF maps of where everyone should be that day, and it said go to the Capitol at 1. So I went to the Capitol at 1, and I saw them trying to overthrow the government, just like they said they were going to do, online in public for months. So I just I come to this work from a slightly different background. I'm not a professional journalist or an academic. I come to this work as sort of from the background of community defense. So I do, I work as an independent journalist, but with the grounding in community defense. So I do what I do because I understand what happens when you let these people do what they do. So my goal is to get them offline. This event was as big as it was because they had uninterrupted platforms to recruit, to advertise, to make their little jokes online, to make it seem like it was going to be fun and no one was going to get arrested. And it's important to just push them back underground because this was way too easy for them. And I lost track of the question. I'm sorry, Joan.
No, that's good. No, that's a good segue too, because Kathleen, I'd love to hear your reaction to that and like, how you could, with what you know about how movements do get pushed either into the spotlight or underground, what kind of signals were you seeing? Oh, muted. Zoom bingo. I win.
I think Molly's starting point here is great to think about sort of the sense of surprise that people had as those events unfolded at the Capitol on January 6th, because I think, I assume that none of us here were surprised in the least. This is exactly what this movement has said that they were planning to do. As Molly said, it was organized in public. It was completely blatant. It was a public action. So I think the misconceptions around how could this happen, we're so surprised. Many newscasters were saying things like, this is not who we are. It's just very hard to believe that if you've read any of the story of what has brought us to this point. And I think, the good news about that is that history really does have some information for us about who these activists are, what kind of resources they use, what their infrastructure looks like, what their recruitment networks look like, what kind of violence we can expect to see moving forward. And with that history in hand, I think we have a set of responses that we might easily take up. The other thing I would say is that for me, the shift point about the 6th was the lead up actions that really were calling out to the frame of the Turner Diaries, which for those who aren't familiar is a dystopian novel. If you're a white power activist, it's a utopian novel that imagines a successful white revolution that overthrows the United States and then carries out a genocide of all people of color and Jewish people throughout the world. It's a profoundly violent book. And the imagery in Turner Diaries was all over the place on January 6th, from the gallows outside the Capitol to the pipe bomb plants that now look like they were designed to perhaps pull law enforcement away from responding. There's a whole bunch of cues that we have. There was footage going around of Proud Boys saying, read the Turner Diaries. There's a whole bunch of information we have about how they're using that novel to structure what they're doing. And notably, in that book, there is a lot of genocide, a lot of mass violence, but there is an attack on the Capitol building in the book that is not an act of genocide and mass violence, but is meant instead as a public-facing recruitment action and as a show of force. I think that's how we have to respond to January 6th. And one thing we should know is that that means that mass violence is very likely still to come.
I'm not going to say great. I'm just going to say thank you for your knowledge. Yeah, this is not great. Not great. F minus, right? Brandi, you are also have been in the throes of this campaigns that you've run with Color of Change around blood money and trying to challenge some of the resources that these movements have been able to gather over the years. What were you looking out for in the last few months?
Yeah, I mean, I think as folks have said, this story has been a long time coming. One of the things that I've often talked about is as new communications platforms emerge, there's this rush to kind of to find those communication tools for different reasons. And so Black people and marginalized groups tend to be the fastest adopters of new technology because it's the like new tool that they can use to like organize or speak truth to power, all of these things. But on the other side of that story, you also have this long history of white nationalists, particularly after it fell out of fashion to have the more sort of performative aspects of Klansmanship with, public white hoods. They found a digital hood in the safety of the internet, and so became both the sort of pioneers and builders of, some of the internet platforms in which we engage. And so this has been a really long time coming, but certainly in some of the ways in which we saw, Trump and others really drumming up this idea of voter fraud and really laying the groundwork for that long before we had even gotten to election day. There were so many different signs that I'm going to be robbed. I'm going to be robbed. And he was like, sort of, winding that up. And then as soon as the election results came in, it was like all signs go. So we knew that there was going to be this like increase in antagonism and public displays of grievance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, the one thing that was so irksome is let me preface this. I know many great journalists that didn't do this. But there was some journalism that seemed to treat what Trump was doing as a bit of a joke, as kind of absurd in some ways. And as a result, really downplayed the possibility for violence on the 6th. And I know that Color of Change and many others were really trying to understand the role that racialized disinformation was playing in that moment. So that we can understand that the people that were actually being disenfranchised, right, is this multiracial democracy that voted for a change in power. And, there was some like kind of lullsiness around, well, is he really going to leave, and that part of it was, for some of us was like, well, if he doesn't, like, there's a pretty good chance he's going to try not to, like this isn't, the exact way in which you would hope that we would end up in a place. But I think because of the amount of lies he was telling and the amount of like absurdist theater around litigation, that it was really hard to take it seriously. Emily, I want to go to you next about, what were you seeing? And I know that we're all on the same internet. But from the vantage point of being in Berlin, I'm sure it felt a little bit strange.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've been trying to do, and one of the things that sort of drew me to Berlin, is that Berlin is obviously a place that has seen this before in its history, right? And it's impossible to avoid the reminders of it when you're traveling around the city. And one of the things that I've been following is trying to track the evolution of the German and greater European far-right movements and mirror those, or see how they act as a mirror to what's happening in the United States. Because we know that there is a lot of communication between these groups. There's financial networks that cross the ocean. There's recruiting, and there's chat rooms, and there's all of that stuff. And so what struck me on the 6th was that not just that we had seen this at state houses, starting with the Richmond, Virginia State House in almost a year prior, which had the potential to be a very violent event. But also that we saw similar action in Germany just a few months before. So in August, there was a very similar movement in Germany that has become this amalgam of sort of anti-lockdown, anti-COVID measures, neo-Nazis, this sort of QAnon type conspiracy theory that's all kind of mixed into one called the Querdenken movement. And they actually in August managed to storm the Reichstag. They didn't get inside, but they got to like the stairs, and they didn't really try to get inside too much. There was also another incident where some AfD politicians were alleged to have let in some of these far-right actors. So you see all of these parallels that we have in the 6th, like these allegations of far-right politicians letting people in, these, this mass, overrunning of the police barricades. So this has happened before, and this is not an accident that this has happened before. And so for me, just looking at that, it just, if we only focus on what's happening domestically, we're missing that this is part of a bigger global network.
I see everybody shaking their heads because we know, we've been through the memes about no more brother wars, right? This idea that the borders are stronger together, but of course this has a very Western civ kind of lens through which we tell these stories and these possibilities and these kinds of histories. So I appreciate that. Whitney, solve it. Tell us what to do.
Well, to the original question,
Thank you for deflecting.
No, hey, we've only got an hour, friend. But no, so heading into this, I had been teaching a class on the 2020 election. And, so in order to prep for that class, I sort of identified 6 or 7, particular issues, historical issues that would be relevant to talk about. But certain things became recurring throughout the semester. And so what would happen in the class is that I would sort of point the students to certain kinds of discourses and say, okay, well, we have to pay attention to this because by next week, I promise you, this is going to come up again. And, discourses around stop the steal, or not stop the steal, but what preceded stop the steal, but the idea of voter fraud, as Brandi was noting, that those conversations were happening all the time. We were basically being prepped that Trump was prepping people that the election was going to be stolen, particularly post-summer when the polling was suggesting that he was really in for a rough go. And so, and all of that is to sort of loop back to where my interest is in all of this, that I haven't been specifically studying the extreme of the far right. I have been studying the mainstream of the far right and discourses around voter fraud and all the ways that Democrats and the liberals in this sort of big umbrella, that they were out to get Trump, they were out to steal the election, that they were hyping up COVID in order to hurt Trump's reelection chances. This is something that is just in the air. And so what I was doing with my students was prepping them. This is going to come up again. And not only is it going to come up again next week, this is going to be the structuring narrative that it leads us through the election. And then on the other side of it, whatever happens, whatever bad thing happens, you need to remember these discourses that are starting at the outset of the semester. So, I was not, making any kind of prediction about what exactly would happen, but it was so clear that something was going to, because when, a lot of people, when they look at QAnon or some of the more extreme elements of those theories, there's a tendency to sort of cordon those off and say, well, that's extreme. And it's not. It's a continuum of belief. And the core of those beliefs that the Democrats were out to get Trump and are out to get, conservative generally, that is so fundamental to so much discourse around politically that's happening right now. So that's what makes me very nervous about this event. This was not confined to the people who participated in the insurrection. It was certainly not confined to Donald Trump. This is a very normal kind of set of claims that is going to stay with us long after we sort of deal with the immediate fallout from the insurrection itself.
Very good points, and I agree with you. I just did a presentation for University of Illinois, really just going back over the Biden laptop fumble and how the White House and Bannon and Giuliani had tried to plant this big story, and it kind of, it just kind of didn't happen. And but the way in which the New York Post was complicit, and the Wall Street Journal was pitched on the project, was pitched on the laptop idea, but didn't take it, right? These kind of media manipulation tactics where you put these things into the world and then you pretend like you're just covering it. Oh, I'm just a journalist. I'm just Steve Bannon, a tiny journalist over here with my YouTube channel. And then you find out, oh yeah, you're planting fake science reports. You're planting this laptop story. You're part of this big lie that rolled out after the election, planting the Peter Navarro documents about, but it goes to show, though, how much people rely on information that they get online, and they think it's evidence. They think it's evidence of some kind of collusion. And make no mistake, none of us on this call want to be carrying water for the government. There are problems, right? There is, a massive issue with representative governments across the globe, and and there's also massive issues with the technology as it is built, and how and who it allows to amplify information in bad faith, especially. I want to get into some of the actual, a little bit of the nitty gritty of the kind of work that you all do. I want to start with you, Brandi, to talk a little bit about the Blood Money campaign and how you, at Color of Change, even conceptualized, well, here's something we can do something about, right? Maybe we can't, stop all the disinformation. Maybe we can't do these other things, but here's something that we can take action on.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, as we've already talked about, there have been a lot of signs that this has been coming, and that there are sentiments that are being drummed up, and this has been true for years. And we know through US history in particular that signs of progress, and particularly Black progress, is often met with white violence. And so one of the things that we had already begun noticing at Color of Change before the election took place was that there was this uptick. One, we were noting the uptick in hate crimes that were going on, like the year going into the election. We were receiving a heightened number of death threats and attacks on our systems as a Black organization doing racial justice work. And then we were doing political organizing to turn out the vote. And some of the conversations that we were having were like really alarming. And this indicator that Trump was maybe, closer to winning than polling said. And so Trump wins, and we're in this position where it's almost like this unleashing of Pandora's box, where it's like people feel in their shared vote that they are like sort of released of having to hide, and that they can like kind of have a coming out party. And so less than a month after the election, I met this like really smart and cool person from UCLA named Joan Donovan, and she gave this like presentation about the history of white nationalism online and how the organizing was working. And that was like a game changer for us, because I think we didn't fully catch on to the fact that I knew about Stormfront, I knew about these like platforms, but the financialization and the networking that other folks have described was something we weren't aware of. And so coming out of the meeting that I had with Joan, our team thought about, we can't go to white nationalists and say, hey, white nationalists, stop being white nationalists. But what we can do is go to the people that maybe have something to lose by being associated with white nationalism. It's not on brand. And who are those people? Corporations, credit card companies, PayPal. So that began a series of negotiations of us targeting them to say, hey, did you know that like on this website where people are selling bullets dipped in pig's blood, that your credit card logo is on there? What are you going to do about it? And that initially was like a slow going process. To be honest, like PayPal worked with us a little bit sooner, so we were able to get some groups get money taken away from a number of groups, over 100 by the time that it was said and done. But really, people didn't see, like, it took Charlottesville, unfortunately, it takes that like explosion of violence for people to really feel shame about the ways that they've enabled it. So when Charlottesville happened, we went live on a Blood Money site, bloodmoney.org, which I think is still up, folks can check it out, calling out these credit card companies and putting a list of the hate groups that were active online and which credit card companies people could submit payment through. And so through that, and then negotiating with the credit card companies, again, we were able to get well over 100 groups taken down, but as we see, that wasn't nearly enough.
Yeah, well, I think, but what it does is it gives the genesis of an idea, the genesis of a tactic, and I have seen numerous great substantial campaigns in journalism from particularly April Glazier, who is also a former fellow here, who went to Shopify to say, hey, there's some white supremacist T-shirts and things on here. She did a really great story on the way the Proud Boys were making money on internet merch. Emily, you too have been in this world of looking at this issue, not necessarily from, let's get tech companies to do something, but actually taking matters into your own hands and being able to collate all of these, I don't know how you do it with all of these different court cases and whatnot, but tell us about First Vigil and how you do it. I'm like genuinely very, very curious.
I think, there's a bit of me that kind of goes back to like when I was a kid and I like collected things and I just needed to like get all of the things to make a set. And it's kind of this like weird tendency that I have now to try to make this, get the complete set of documents and cases and all of that to really try to understand what's happening. But the motivation for First Vigil actually started a few years ago. And what had happened was it was October 2018, and there were a number of things that happened in the span of like 2 weeks. We had this incident with Proud Boys in Manhattan, where they were engaged in some gang violence. And that was followed by the incident where the MAGA bomber was sending pipe bombs to like CNN and to some Congress people and stuff like that. And then there was a shooting in Louisville where a white man killed 2 black people in a supermarket. And then of course there's the tragedy of the Pittsburgh Tree of Life shooting where a neo-Nazi went in and killed 11 people. And all of this happened within like a 12-day period. And then sort of hidden in all of that was this little piece of news about a neo-Nazi who was sentenced for an attack from the year before. And the court documents revealed that he had marched in Charlottesville, but none of us had really, like a couple people noticed the articles when it came out, like, when there was a news article months prior that he pled guilty, and we kind of said, oh, look, here's another Charlottesville clown that's pleaded guilty to violence. But nobody really knew who he was. So I decided to look into who he was. And I found that he was marching next to James Fields, who was the terrorist that attacked us in Charlottesville. And that was like the biggest wake up for me. It was like, I'm sorry, but when you have 2 convicted terrorists marching together, you don't have a lone wolf, you have a pack. And whatever it might be, we need to do a better job. We need to have better early warning on this. And it was embarrassing to me, actually, that nobody had caught that, despite the fact that the evidence was sitting there in public records. So my motivation was basically, let's expose this, let's surface this, let's build a resource to help journalists who track this stuff keep these threads fresh, because it's months between between dates in a case. Like the Pittsburgh Tree of Life case, that was almost 3 years ago at this point. It was over 2 years ago, certainly. Still hasn't gone to trial, right? So if you're somebody that's writing about that, it's going to be very hard for for you to remember all of the little details along the way. So that's the motivation behind First Vigil, is to try to give a better resource for that.
Yeah, and I do think that, yeah, a lot of this relies on individuals like you. I mean, I am thinking here about, there was some database work that had been done years ago before the murder of Mike Brown in Ferguson, where data scientists, sociologists were using CSV files just to kind of keep track of news about people who had been killed by police and killed in police custody. And that missing statistic, right, that we don't know in the United States how many people every year are killed by police, it's frightening that there are these missing data sets, or maybe missing's not the right word. There's a failure to apply the resources to do the work to make that visible. And at some point, you have to realize that omission and silence is a political strategy, right? Omission isn't just, oh, I forgot. Especially after, I think it was WAPO won the Pulitzer for their journalism, trying to count the amount of people that were killed in the U.S. by police. And so it's not a trivial thing to spend this time that you do drawing those things together, creating that resource, making it queryable, and making sure that journalists have access to it. And I was wondering, Molly, from your perspective, because you do a similar data practice where you are very, very good at finding very minor notes in people's histories, as well as in their social media footprints. But one of the things that I really respect about the way that you do your work is you don't do it in public. In the sense that, I don't ever know what's coming, but when I see you post, I know that it's been thoroughly researched and vetted, and there's a lot of receipts. And do you want to talk a bit about that process, and how, working alongside, other activists and journalists and knowing where to look, in particular is something that I think you're an ACEs researcher when it comes to that. And yeah, if you want to talk about that at all.
Yeah, I mean, doxing is, I think, a dirty word to a lot of people. It sounds like something that is nasty, and it hurts when it's done to you. But I think it's like anything else, it's a tool. Some tools can be used as weapons. That doesn't make it a bad tool for its intended purpose. I was thinking about this recently, and it didn't occur to me until after the interview was done. The actual answer to this, the first person I ever doxed, it was I was reading the comments on a Facebook post on a local news article. This was in December 2017, so really just months after the Unite the Right attack. And someone was being very nasty to Heather Heyer's mom. Someone was like in the comments of this local news article attacking Heather Heyer's mother personally and like showing her pictures of her dead daughter. And I thought, I guess I can't swear because this is
you can swear. We're just on Zoom. That's fine.
Fuck this guy. Yeah. Like, who is this man? Why is he saying this dead woman's mother? And so I doxed him, because he deserved it. He was dangerous and he was hurting my community, and we needed to know who he was and why he was like this. And that to me is why I do this. These people are hurting my community. They're hurting my friends and family. They're hurting their own communities. They're probably hurting their families. And it's community defense, it's self-defense, and it's community defense. I'm not trying to physically harm these people. I'm not trying to punish them. I'm not trying to extort them. I'm just making it clear that this is who you are, and people should know that. It's not a dirty word. Anti-fascism is not dirty. And I think that's, I think more people are opening themselves up to that. I noticed in the wake of the Capitol siege, a lot of like pretty run-of-the-mill resistance libs were like trying to dox these people. That all of a sudden they realized this is a valid mode of operation, that when someone acts out like this in public, it's okay to say in public, hey, I know who that guy is. He's my neighbor. He's my mom. He's my coworker, because that's who these people are. And we need to be able to identify them in our spaces. So I'm actually, this project is going public soon, I think. So I'm allowed to talk about it. I'm a researcher with Deplatform Hate. It's a sort of small collective of people who do this work independently and have been doing it independently for a long time. Back in October, we realized there's violence coming. There's real violence coming. And, we're all doing our best in our own spaces to root it out and to find it. But this is going to be a really concentrated couple of months. This was, right before the election. And so we came together and sort of marshaled our resources together and laid out a game plan to try and disrupt some of these communities around the election. I talked a guy out of shooting up a polling place on a militia forum. Like it was real work. And what we're doing right now is really focusing on just getting these people to log off, just disrupting their ability to communicate. I'm sure Kathleen knows, forcing them underground doesn't make them stop. There are plenty of, violent underground communities that still organize, they meet in person, they have each other's phone numbers. But if you can get them off MeWe, if you can get them off PayPal, if you can get them off GoDaddy, like it makes it harder for them to recruit and harder to organize. Having been doing this in a really concentrated, organized way for the last, 4 months, there are conversations that I had with companies in November that I contacted again on January 7th, and they responded really differently afterwards. I said to a company in November, hey, the Oath Keepers are using your platform to contact their members. They're, I send them all these receipts about the Oath Keepers, who they are, what they do. This is the kind of messaging they're sending through your servers. Is that okay with you? How do you feel about that? And they never answered me. I contacted them repeatedly and they never even replied. January 7th, I emailed them again. And I said, here are some videos of guys in Oath Keepers patches, beating a cop, breaking a window in the Capitol building. And here are the emails that they sent to their members, advising them to illegally carry guns. Here are the emails they sent to their members through your servers, telling them, if you buy bullets through this link, it funds us and our travel. And now that they're charged with criminal conspiracy, are you liable here? And you shouldn't have to tell these companies, you could be legally liable in a federal criminal conspiracy to get them to act. But I think companies are starting to realize that this hurts us. Our association with this hurts us. And so being able to come to these companies, it's having years of experience infiltrating these communities gives us access to those receipts to come to these companies with. And so hopefully that will bear some fruit and make it harder for them to organize, recruit, and fundraise. So that's
and I think that's one of the things that it allows us to do our work on disinformation, media manipulation tracking, is that there are so many digital traces. There are so many ways in which people, well, like we should also preface with the January 6th, a lot of people weren't trying to hide. They weren't in any way.
They thought they were going to win.
Yeah, well, they did. They also were pretty upset that Steve Bannon got the pardon and not them, right? They were like, wait, we were all supposed to get pardons here and Trump's now out of office, right? And of course, but it is, for those networks of people that do need to get resources, that do need to organize in these either semi-public or private forums, there's nothing new here. It used to be, in the basements of gun shops and all kinds of other places and bar rooms that people would do this prior to the internet, but it was hyper local then. Kathleen, I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about how the internet has changed hate movements, changed white power movements.
Sure. And I think I also might be able to connect what we're talking about to a couple of the questions in our Q&A also, particularly the set of questions around how do we not have this information already? Like, why does it come to communities and independent journalists and other activist measures to aggregate this data and connect the dots? And I think the answer to both of those things is that there is a very long history of what we know and don't know about this movement that is imbricated in all kinds of other sources of inequality. So first of all, we can go all the way back to the counterintelligence program of the FBI in the 60s and the FBI surveillance mechanisms afterward to see that the problem of not paying attention, not aggregating data, not counting, not infiltrating these groups is a long and very durable feature of their existence and their ability to continue. Now, I think that anyone who's studied anything about the history of the FBI or has read any stories about kind of the general issues with our incarceration in this country should be hesitant to think that just law enforcement and surveillance is going to fix this problem. It can't. This is a social problem that operates across many different levels of our society. But the reason we don't have numbers and the reason we don't have mechanisms for enforcement, it's not because we don't have laws about terrorism. It's because of the way we designate and the way we use the resources that we do have on the books. So it's only in the last few years that the DHS and the FBI have decided that white supremacist extremism is now the largest terrorist threat to the nation. And I'll note that even those agencies say that that threat outstrips Islamic terrorism and also far outstrips what some people would term, well, what Trump called, quote unquote, Antifa and the left, which I think reasonable people agree that there is not data to support being anywhere near as sweeping of a social issue. It's not something that is existing in a cell structure that is carrying out a broad campaign of violent organization. It just isn't. Meanwhile, the right is doing that. The other thing that the white power movement has done since the early 1980s is use the proto-internet and use cell-style organizing to sort of coordinate violent action across the country and across time. So as early as 1984, these groups were using something called LibertyNet, which was an early password-protected network of message boards that included things like ideology and assassination lists, but also included things like personal ads. So we see right away that this is a double problem, not just of violent organizing, but also of social networking, and that those two things work together to create the ties between activists that allow them to mobilize and launch violent attacks. The social part is important, and we see that escalating really dramatically right now, but it's something that's been in place for decades, if not generations. The other part of it is the idea of the lone wolf, which is a fiction that everyone should know was created by this movement. The term lone wolf came from the white power movement into our media, not the other way around. This movement has bent over backward to disappear its ties between activists, to make it look like the disconnected madmen doing X, Y, or Z. It has really attempted to disappear over and over and over again. And when we let it do that, we lose all kinds of capacity for response. But I will say that one thing that stands out to me about the work that Molly and Emily are doing, the work that many other people in communities impacted by this movement are doing, is that when this violence comes to your hometown, it has a very different meaning than it does when it's abstract and somewhere else. So that means that Charlottesville and El Paso and Pittsburgh all have something in common. And that means that all of us share this burden after the events of January 6th. That was an attack on our country. That was an attack on our democracy. And we all share in that.
I appreciate that. And I think that I'm going to have to be really careful about dating sites that I go on in the future. No, I'm just kidding. I got married long ago. My wife would be really angry with me. But it is, it actually does remind me of this moment post Charlottesville where even OkCupid was willing to stand up and say, no, we're not going to let, this neo-Nazi on our website. Right. And like the extent of that deplatforming and moving people around in the infrastructure, I'm thinking a lot about this moment right now where many people are experiencing this moment. I think us on this Zoom are not feeling the same kind of relief, which is that a lot of people are taking a moment to sigh and say, oh, isn't it great? Trump's gone. And I'm just like, no, know. Like, we're in a period of abeyance. Usually when movements go into a period of abeyance, they figure out what the missing pieces are and they gear up for something else, whether it's a series of networked and distributed protests where, Kathleen, you're suggesting, you know, that this might be every town that is having to deal with some of this in some ways, but also that movements like this tend to crave a kind of charismatic leadership and permissioning in some ways. And so that's what we've been going through for the last 4 years, is watching this movement gain momentum through this kind of tacit permissioning by political leadership. And so, Whitney, as a way to wrap up, I'd love to have you kick us off by starting off a little bit about any reactions that you had to things that you had heard, and then you know, we don't have to make this roses and sunshine. It's not the exact end of the day yet. But, you know, what do you think's on the horizon? What should we be looking out for? And yeah, and we can kind of leave it at that.
Yeah, I mean, so I think it's really important how we tell these stories. And so to the point, to Kathleen's point about the lone wolf, which is such an important point to raise, you know, one of the things that I have been thinking a lot about in figuring out how do you communicate some of these issues to everyday folks, not just to journalists, but like, you know, our moms and our friends and our uncles, and like, how do we have these conversations? I have found that using ecological metaphors can be really helpful because it's a way of sort of grounding the issues in sort of a sensory experience that we can all share. And so the way that I think about this conversation about lone wolves is I like using the idea of a biomass pyramid. So in biomass pyramids in biology, that's the relative weight and number of one class of organism compared to the relative weight and number of another organism in the same ecosystem. So you have the lions and tigers and bears at the top, and then you have like foxes, and then you have like rabbits, and then you have like worms. And that's not how science works, but just as visual, well, work with me. So one of when people talk about harm online, whether it's white supremacist harms, whether it's other kinds of coordinated harassment, they often they focus on the lions and tigers and bears. They focus on the apex predators. And it makes a lot of sense that people would want to do that. They have the biggest bites, they're scariest. But the problem with that, when you're just focusing on essentially the top of the pyramid, it's very easy to lend itself to a kind of symptoms thinking rather than systems thinking. Because if you were to deal with the apex predators somehow, but you're not dealing with the underlying ecological conditions at the base of the pyramid, it's only a matter of time before there's going to be more lions and tigers and bears, because everything that was nourishing them before is still going to be, you know, there for the next crop to sort of roar to the top. And so a lot of the conversations around Trump and around even some amount of deplatforming, I mean, deplatforming and figuring out what to do about these folks is absolutely critical, but we can't be sort of, I don't know, feeling comfortable that if we just we just deplatform them, then the problem is solved, like we're good, everything is fine. That we have to think about how do we address the ecological conditions while at the same time dealing with the apex predators. We have to deal with them, absolutely. We had to deal with Trump, but Trump is symptomatic as much as he is an actual problem unto himself. And figuring out what to do about the underlying ecological conditions, that's big, because that means we have to talk about education. We have to talk about all kinds of really important cultural, social issues. And so I'm not saying that there's instantly a solution, because if there was one, we would have figured it out already. But getting people to understand the totality of the ecosystem, the totality of the biomass, and how different things feed into the subsequent strata, and how that helps feed and nourish, create the conditions for the apex predators. That's the first step in really helping people understand what they can do within their own families, within their own workplaces, within their own communities, that until there's buy-in there, until there's an understanding that the little stuff feeds into the big stuff. And if we're gonna deal with the big stuff, we've gotta go down to the base. That being able to tell that story and helping people understand how they fit is really a first step, in a critical step in ultimately dealing with the conditions that bring us to the Trumps and company of the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a few years ago, I was in conversation with Tarso Ramos from the Political Research Associates, and he was like, we got to understand this as button down white nationalism, right? That they don't just come dressed as skinheads. They don't come easily seen. And as a result, it requires a different set of strategies for dealing with different kinds of white supremacists at different stratas and different organizing structures, from the kind of street fighting set that, these populist movements that tend to come with far right governments, all the way up to, authoritarian rulers. Brandi, in terms of this moment of the glitch that we're in, what are you anticipating might be the next wave, or what's on the horizon for U.S. politics?
Yeah, so I mean, I think I want to go back to, again, these different stories of the internet and its history, and as we've talked about. And so at the top layer, you have the ways in which marginalized groups around the world use the big tech platforms in public ways to organize towards equity. And below the surface, you had this the tentacles of this kind of web that's groups that are pushing back against progress, and then building community online with the new digital hood. And then you have the story of the tech companies themselves and the ways in which they have sought to gain power through and access to people's data through polarization. So oftentimes the tech companies will say, we don't make our money from polarization, we don't monetize it. And to a certain extent, that's true, disingenuous. They make their money from data and the collection and the mass collection of our data. The polarization is the carrot. It's the thing that brings people onto the platforms and into these different communities and keep people engaged. So there's a couple things here. One, the ways in which the internet is built doesn't necessarily look for race, it looks for interest. So one of the new phenomena that we're seeing, which actually did take place on January 6th, but was less reported, is that you see it's a more multiracial, multi-ethnic movement that we're seeing on the hard right. My cousin, who's a Black woman, was actually there and is like a follower of QAnon. And so I think if we're not paying attention to this and just disregard those things that are happening, like Trump actually gained more voters from communities of color than Biden did. If we're not paying attention to that, we will miss the next wave of what this looks like. And then the second thing, if we're not talking about regulation and antitrust and like expanding this fight beyond just like deplatforming the disinformation, we are missing the opportunity to really ensure that we can have an internet that we want to see.
And I'm with you on that. I wrote an op-ed with Ahmed Khan about this very thing, which is if tech companies do buddy up to the Biden administration, we are probably unlikely to see movements on antitrust as well as regulation that does put community safety at the center of the design. Kathleen, some final thoughts?
Oh man, final thoughts. I think I would go a step further and worry that this movement is not in abeyance, and that in many spaces, January 6th was seen as a resounding victory, and that the parts of the groundswell that we saw storm the Capitol that are older and deeper and more organized are now radicalizing within sort of the QAnon and Trump-based communities, and that is all a recipe for growth and not for retreat. And I would also say that I'm not convinced that many of these activists didn't love Trump the way that they said they did, but perhaps were using the window of opportunity thrown open for their own reasons, which have been across time fundamentally anti-democratic and very violent. So I'm concerned not only that Trump is no longer in charge of this groundswell, but also that he never was. And I think that we have every reason to think that this is building instead of receding.
Mm-hmm. No, I feel you on that, especially as I think about how this group is typically when you see disruptions in infrastructure, it's just a temporary kind of moment where they do eventually figure out how to find each other once again and do that planning work. Molly, some final thoughts from you as well?
Yeah, I think what Whitney was saying about the importance of how we ethically, properly tell these stories, that's going to be critical right now. You know, they think the events of January 6th, I mean, it was kind of like Unite the Right in a way that it brought to mainstream consciousness this problem that we all have all known was there all along. It sort of bubbled back up into our collective national consciousness. So, you know, I went to the annual gun lobby day in Richmond 2 weeks after the 6th. And I talked to some reporter who's, you know, he was interviewing a Boogaloo boy and like taking lots of pictures of him. And I asked him what outlet he was with, and he said Business Insider. You know, Business Insider is sending a guy to interview the Boogaloo boy. So like mainstream reporters with no background in this at all are platforming fascists in their business magazines. You know, when you were a kid and you had those scented markers and you'd smell like the black one smelled the worst. You'd smell it and you go, oh my God, that smells awful. And your first reaction would be to hold it up to your friend and say, you smell it. It smells terrible. You smell it. And they would. That's not journalism. You can't do journalism that way. You know, you interview the craziest Q person you can find and you put them and do a splashy photo shoot and put them on the front page and say, look at this fucking psychopath. Isn't this hilarious? That's not good. Mm-hmm. That's not productive. That's not helpful. It's harmful to the person you're interviewing. It's harmful to everyone who consumes it. So I understand that these mainstream outlets have, you know, editorial requirements where if you write about someone, you have to reach them for comment. I get that. I don't think that should necessarily be the case if we're talking about people who are very dangerous. But when you reach a fascist for comment, don't just publish it plain. Don't just put it in there and say, well, this is what he said. I don't know. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. That happened with the New York Times pretty recently, as they went and interviewed several and took photos of them, like in their nice apartments and everything. It's just not a good look. And it does remind me a lot of after Charlottesville, where, you know, people were racing to interview, you know, the alt-right. And, you know, but I agree with you that we need journalists to care about the audience in that respect, which is to say that you don't want to introduce the audience to certain key phrases or hashtags without giving them the context and the information they need in order to respond in kind. And I know that you do a lot of work to get journalists to understand that, do a lot of that helpful guidance to make them understand and connect to people in communities that can be a good source of a narrative that really matters, which is people that are impacted by this kind of violence and organizing.
And for the journalists watching this, I'd be happy to talk to you on background about why you should not interview that Nazi that you're going to call tomorrow. I'll be happy to talk to you. Just reach out.
I know you will talk to them. So it's great. It's great. Emily, the last word, please.
Yeah, I mean, so we've talked a lot about Charlottesville in this panel because Charlottesville was in a very strong sense, a turning point. And it's shocking because, you know, it wasn't, you know, more people died in the El Paso killings or the Pittsburgh Tree of Life killings. There's been a lot more violence at other events. What is it? I often think, what is it about Charlottesville that left a mark? And when I think about that, and now it's been almost 4 years, and it's in my mind every day. What sticks out to me is that it was a moment that revealed our biases. It revealed our naked biases. The shock of President Trump's comments about very fine people being on both sides, which may have very well been the death knell of his campaign, was shocking to us because it broke a norm. It wasn't shocking to us because it was a vulgar comment. It was shocking to us because we have been conditioned to accept violence at scale so long as we go through these motions afterwards, so long as the president appears at the church and prays, and so long as the media, you know, goes through its motions. And so long as we have the right, soft focus on the victims, we have to realize that in this information age, we are not passive bystanders. We are participants, and we are part of a feedback cycle. And we do not understand, or we do not see that we are part of this feedback cycle. And so what I think is the most important thing to take from the 6th, to take from all of these moments, and to take moving into the next 4 years, is to recognize that we have to seriously and strongly interrogate our biases, what we think is normal, ask ourselves why we think something is normal, and then be able to and be willing to do the work to find out what is right, and also knowing when it's time to step back and to uplift another voice, because we cannot be experts on everything. So for me, that is the enduring lesson of what's happened in Charlottesville. And that's, I think, in order to fix the media, we have to fix ourselves first.
I appreciate that. I want to say thank you. I know we're over time, but you all are so right and so good at what you do. And I appreciate the things that you've done to shed light in the last few weeks and in the last few years on these issues, and each in our own way contribute to a kind of, whole of society approach to dealing with this problem. And I agree, Emily, that part of it has to do with step up, step back, and also make way for others, right? And so as we're thinking about the next few weeks and few years, and how the media spectacles are going to play out around Trump and QAnon, let's keep our eyes on these white power movements. Let's keep our eyes on where the money's going. Let's keep our eyes on how it's showing up in communities, and make sure that we understand the relationship between the wires and the weeds. That is, what's happening in our online environments is as healthy as what is happening in our other offline environments. And so thank you to everybody on this call, and let's keep rolling with it. It was a pleasure to talk to you. You're all very, very beautiful and smiley folks. And so I really appreciate it. That's how I trick people into smiling, is I tell them that they're smiling. So I'll see you all on the internet.
Thank
Have
you.
a good one.
Thanks, everybody. Great.
Thank you.
Bye.